Hi, this is Kevin Trainer. Welcome to my lecture on Chapter 14 of the Interaction Design 4th edition textbook. Chapter 14 is entitled Evaluation Studies from Controlled to Natural Settings. And it's really a pretty close follow-on to what we talked about in Chapter 13, which I think was called something like Introducing Evaluation. So more particulars here, but the same topic. Okay, so let's get started. So the aims in the chapter are to explain how to do usability testing, to outline the basics of experimental design, because in some of this testing we really are running proper experiments, and to describe how to do field studies. So let's talk about usability testing. Usability testing involves recording the performance of typical users doing typical tasks. Typically, we want to do that in a controlled setting. In that controlled setting, the users are observed and timed. Data is recorded on video, and key presses are logged. The data is used to calculate performance at times and to identify and to explain user errors. User satisfaction is evaluated using questionnaires and interviews as follow-ups. Field observations may be used to provide contextual understanding. Pretty consistent with what we said back in Chapter 13. Let's talk about experiments in usability testing. So experiments test hypotheses to discover new knowledge by investigating the relationship between two or more variables. And there's a really good visual, couple of slides down the road here, where we try to compare how you might be doing usability testing for a kind of practice, for system development as a practitioner with other practitioners, and how you might do it as more of a researcher, I guess more pure research. And so we'll get to that, but here, when we're talking about having experiments to test hypotheses, we're coming down, I think, stronger on the researcher side. Looking at this, we can think of usability testing as applied experimentation. Developers check that the system is usable by the intended user population for their tasks. And one issue that keeps coming up as we go through the textbook is how reasonable is it going to be if we're a practitioner and we're working with developers? How reasonable is it going to be that we'll have two or more alternative versions of the user interface to test? And in my experience, it's going to be most of the time, I think we're only going to have one. Okay, so we're going to have one, and we're going to be trying to measure that experience. But we can have two, and of course, to the extent that we have two or more, well, we're happy little social scientists now, aren't we? All right, but we don't have to have two. Here's the slide that I talked about. Here's where we're trying to contrast usability testing and research. So usability testing, why do we do it? Well, we want to improve our products. or improve the design for a product that we're developing. We have few participants, so we don't have a whole lot of subjects. The results of the testing inform the design. It's usually not completely replicable, which is to say, we may be doing this in such a way that if we went to publish it in a research journal, we might not, when the referees read our paper, they would say, this is a little short in terms of good experimental design, and I'd like you guys to go back and do some more work before we're going to publish your paper, right? Because we're not doing this as publishable research. We're doing this to inform our practice, right? Our conditions are going to be controlled as much as possible. The procedure that we follow is going to be planned. And the results are going to be reported to developers. So we're going to be as professional as possible, but we might not go to the full extent that we would go to if we're over in the right column of the slide. And in that case, we're doing experiments for research, hopefully publishable research, because that's usually the standard. We want to discover knowledge. We're going to have more participants. The results are going to be validated statistically. It must be replicable. We're going to have strongly controlled conditions. So we're going to even go further in terms of controlling the conditions. We're going to pay quite a bit of attention to experimental design. So it's not only going to be a planned procedure, we're going to have a formal experimental design. And the output of this is going to be a scientific report to a scientific community. Hopefully we're going to publish a paper in a respected journal. Okay, whereas on the left side, when we're doing usability testing as part of our usability and design practice, we're going to report to developers. The team's going to make appropriate decisions about the product, and we're going to develop it and take it to market. So usability testing. Well, the goals and questions are going to focus on how well users perform tests with the product. Comparison of products and prototypes is common, but as I've said, it's not mandatory. The focus is on the time to complete the task and the number and type of errors. We tend to collect the data by video and sometimes by logging either keystrokes or clicks, which we're describing here as interaction logging. Testing is important. User satisfaction questionnaires and interviews after the fact provide the data that we need about the user's opinions. So, what kind of testing conditions do we need? Well, we need a usability lab or other controlled space. Our emphasis is on selecting a population of subjects that are representative of the users who are our targets for our product. And we want to develop representative tasks for them to do during the test. How many people do we typically test on? Well, in the text, I think there was a really good discussion that led to the answer 5 to 12. Okay, here we're saying 5 to 10. Typically, when we're doing a real study, we're probably going to want at least 5. Okay. In my class, when we're doing our practice assignment, I say 3 because, we don't want to leave our game in the locker room, right? So to get the feel of what it's going to be like to do our testing. I mean, do we need 5? No, I think not. I think we can get some practice experience with as few as 3. But when we get to the real deal, there seems to be a lot of consensus around 5 or more. Tasks are usually around 30 minutes long. We don't want to get the subjects too weary, right? So 30 minutes, I think, is a good kind of a task time. Task conditions are the same for every participant, so we need to pay attention to that. And we need to get their informed consent, so we need to put together a form that explains the procedures and deals with all the ethical issues, such that they are informed, and being informed, they give their consent. The 2 parts of informed consent. What are the kinds of data that we're going to collect? Well, here are the kind of things that we could collect. The time to complete a task, the time to complete a task after a specified time away from the product, because that's pretty interesting stuff. How quickly does your capability using this particular interface decay when you're away from the product? Number and types of errors per task, number of errors per unit of time. Excuse me. Thank you. Numbers of time online help and manuals are accessed. The number of users making a particular error, the number of users successfully completing a task. So we want to measure things, and these are pretty concrete things that we're able to measure. How many participants is enough for user testing? I think I talked through this pretty well before. When you're really doing it, 5 to 10, 5 to 12, I think makes sense. Some experts would argue that you should continue to test until you aren't getting any new insights. Well, and that's probably true. I could see doing that. The question is, what's your budget? Okay, and again, are you doing this to inform a systems development activity, systems design and development activity, or are you doing this for publishable research? Certainly the requirements for publishable research are significantly higher than those for informed systems design and development decisions. Having said that, unless you're practicing on one of my practice assignments, I think you want at least 5. Okay. Here's a nice picture of a usability lab with 2 observers here in the foreground who are watching a user and an assistant in the background. So this is, this is the way that they would do it in a professional lab. So if you were to hire a consulting firm to do this and you were to pay them real money to do it, this is the kind of environment you might expect them to do it in. Okay. What about portable labs? Well, portable labs are getting more popular. Okay, so we take the lab to the users instead of bring the users to the lab. And this is a portable lab, a lab in a box, is set up by a company called, the device is called the Traxxas. And the idea here is to have the same kind of equipment and capability, but again, to be able to bring the lab to a more convenient user space rather than the other way around. Here's some more portable equipment, and this is part of Traxxas. And this is a camera that's going to show us the touch interactions with a touch screen. So we're going to be able to see the screen, and we're going to be able to see the fingers that are used to touch it, and hopefully that's going to help us in our research. And here's a great photo of of a head-mounted eye tracker. So this is a woman playing tennis, about to hit a forehand or just hit a forehand. I'm not sure which. She looks like she has her eyes on the tennis ball, which is what we teach people all the time. And if you look at her visor, hanging off the visor is the camera. And the camera is taking a picture of her eyes. So what we're going to record is just what her eyes look like. Probably we would be time syncing this with coverage of another camera. So ideally what we would want to be able to do would be to see the ball coming into the racket and see what the eyes are doing. Do they track the ball all the way in? A common problem that people have with tennis is they track the ball, and right about where the ball is now, they stop tracking. They start to think about where they're going next, and their eyes come off of it. So, we wouldn't be making the same use, but we could easily have use for the same kind of equipment. There's a great story, I'll call it, in the chapter about usability testing with the iPad. And a couple of cool things. One, this was done in the younger days of the iPad, where people were still getting experience with the iPad. It was done by a big interaction design consulting firm, so it was done very professionally. And it was essentially done, it wasn't done for Apple. It was done for people who wanted to develop products for the iPad. And they wanted to say, well, just how customized did they have to be? What were the problems? What were the consideration? Do we have to create a custom iPad app for everything? Do normal web applications get the job done? What kind of problems do people have on the iPad? Are they like the problems that they have on iPhones, or are they different? Are they like the problems they have on their desktop, or are they different? So, pretty cool study. Let's see, they came up with 7 participants, so that's more than 5, who had 3 months of experience or more with iPhones. So they didn't want someone who was going to be completely new to the touch interface. They signed an informed consent explaining all the things we see here, the typical things that we promise to our subjects. They were then asked to explore the iPad. And the exploration that they were allowed to do on the iPad was free form. Okay, so they were given the opportunity to do whatever they wanted while they were being observed. Next, they were asked to do randomly assign specific tasks. So what kind of tasks were they asked to do? Well, there's more information in the slides than were in the chapter, and I think if we want to know more yet, there's a link in the well, there's actually a URL at the bottom of the slide here, but I think we can find more detail even yet if we want to know more about the study. So where were the app or websites they had to do? Well, they had them do iBook. That's an app. Craigslist. That's probably a website. eBay, probably a website. Time Magazine, not sure. Epicurious, I think it's a website. And Kayak, I think that's a website too, but I'm not sure. So they were trying to figure out what was the experience on the iPad with these various tests. Here's some of the equipment that they use, and you can see that we have the iPad in a kind of a neutral position where you're not going to be too frustrated by being able to see it well, and reflection issues and orientation issues and all that kind of stuff. And we also have what appears to be a camera over top and probably appropriate lighting as well in that goose neck device, which is going to allow us to record user activity. So, what were the problems and actions that happened? Well, they detected some problems. One is there was a difficulty in accessing the web. And the difficulties was, in a lot of cases, a lack of affordance and feedback. So people were having challenges in just the web surfing experience on the iPad compared to the things that they were used to. They had a problem of getting lost in the applications. And they were doing, although it's not said here, they were doing a lot more tapping than they needed to do. People were kind of over tapping, and they were having a hard time knowing where to tap. What did the evaluators do? Well, they reported their findings to the developers, and again, the developers here were developers who were prospective developers of either applications or websites who wanted to know exactly what the issues were, and they made them they made the reports available to the public on nngroup.com, which is the website of this fairly prominent interaction design consulting firm. And they're going to claim that they believe that accessibility for all users was important, and gosh, it's hard to argue with that, isn't it? But the thing that I like is this the kind of problems that they found, because when I thought back to my early experiences with my iPad, it rang pretty true, right? I think I had a particularly hard time in navigating websites that were built for desktop browsers with my fingers. And yet that's improved over time, and probably from the kind of feedback that came from this kind of a study. So, pretty cool. So let's talk about experiments. Okay. We can go so far in this testing as to really run experiments. So that's going to remind you of a lot of the principles and the terminology that come from the scientific method. So experiments test a hypothesis. They predict a relationship between two or more variables. We often talk about an independent variable that's manipulated by the researcher and a dependent variable that is influenced by the independent variable, right? So the researcher is going to control some condition, okay, that we're able to measure. So that's what we're calling a variable. And the result of the experiment is going to be some outcome that we are able to measure. And we're going to look for a relationship between the independent and the dependent variables that has some kind of a pattern, we hope. Typical experimental designs have one or two independent variables. Okay, so that would also mean that they would have a companion dependent variable. So we're either going to do it with one or two. And the results that we get, we'd like to be able to analyze statistically, and we would like to be able to talk about how, well, the typical stuff that was, I think, pretty well discussed in the chapter, which included things like tests of goodness of statistical results, things like t-tests that they've got a couple of paragraphs on. So what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to say, well, we really believe that the results that we got here were not accidental. And our statistics tell us what the probability was that they were accidental. And in fact, if they're not accidental, then we would expect them to be replicable. We would expect to run the test again and get the, if not the exact same outcome, get an outcome that was consistent with the the outcome that we got before. Experimental designs. Okay, so there are some challenges in how you manage the participants in an experiment. And it has to do with differences between the participants and differences amongst the activities that we have them do. Okay, so first of all, we want to make sure that the differences between the participants are not what's driving the differences in the outcomes, right? The other thing we want to make sure is if we have our participants doing more than one activity, we want to make sure that the order of the activities is not determining the outcome. So here, in terms of the experimental designs, we talk about three on the participant side: different participants, same participants, and matched participants. So the different participants approach, we have a single group of participants is allocated randomly to the experimental conditions. Same participants, all the participants appear in both conditions. And matched participants are matched in pairs based on expertise, gender, etc., and the matched pairs are subjected to the differing conditions. So, how could you look at these three participant design decisions and see what the advantages and the disadvantages are? Well, the different design, there are no order effects. That's one of the advantages. The disadvantages are the many subjects and the different individual preferences is a problem. With the same design, few individuals, no individual differences. Counterbalancing is needed because of ordering effects, so we need to take care of the ordering. And then on the match side, the advantages are the same as the different participants, but individual differences are reduced, so that's good. The disadvantages are, even though we're trying to match people, we don't know how well we match them, so we can't be sure that they've been matched perfectly on all the differences. So, this is pretty important stuff. It's really important if you're trying to publish your research, right? Because people are going to be looking into your experimental design, and you had better be able to account for it. It's also important for usability studies that we're not trying to publish, because we just want to make sure that we can rely on our findings, right? So having these kinds of design decisions in mind can be helpful in both contexts. All right, so we're out of experiments and now we're into field studies. Field studies, as we well know, are done in natural settings. A term that's used often for prototypes of products that are being used freely in natural settings is in the wild studies. I like that expression. I hope you do too. We aim to understand what users do naturally and how a technology impacts them. So we're probably less interested in individual interactions and how long they take and how many errors we get in a particular interaction, and we're more interested in when we're using this product, right? The study that they talk about in the chapter here, again, is the same one we talked about in chapter 13, where they gave a mobile device to skiers, and as you recall back in chapter 13, they were surprised to find out that the skiers were not consulting the mobile device that frequently while they were out on the slopes, but they were poring over the data once they got back in the ski lodge. And so those are the kind of things that you discover somewhat serendipitously when you get out in the wild kind of studies. Field studies are used in product design to identify opportunities for new technology, to sort of understand the use case, determine the design requirements, decide how best to introduce the new technology, evaluate technology in use. So in my mind, being a systems analyst by early training, okay, I'm always interested in what's the use case? How are people going to use this to get their job done or improve their life or become happier than they were? And that has to do with all the questions we see here in blue at the bottom of the slide. Here on slide 22, this is pretty cool. this is this was talked about quite a bit. I just want to point out that some of the devices that we see are not as new as they could be. It's just frightening how fast some of these technologies have died. So this is the compact iPad Pocket PC, which is of course long dead. But could you do this on an iPhone? Sure, you could. Could you do this on an Android device? Yeah, you could do that too. So don't get put off by the picture, right? But this is a context-aware experience sampling tool running on a mobile device. And it's essentially saying, what are you doing in the living room? Are you cleaning? Is it family time? Are you using the telephone? Are you eating? One of the really interesting things when we're using these devices and we're trying to figure out what context people are using them in is that we can actually have the device run part of the questionnaire. You know, from time to time, the device can say, "Hey, what are you doing now?" And are you using the application or are you not using the application? Because, of course, we have a device in their hand. We can use it not only to provide the experience that we're trying to test, but we can also use it to get some feedback on what their experience is at any particular time. It's a pretty cool alternative to asking people to keep a diary. Here's another in the wild study. The way I call this, the way I read the name on this is UBFit Garden. I guess that's what it's called. And this is, again, we have a display for the mobile device that's a little bit long of tooth, right? It's a Singular 2125, which I'm sure was a very good device, but is you probably pick up for $5 these days. But everything that they did here is stuff that could be done on either an iPhone or an Android device. So you you can take that for the current interpretation of the research that we see here. And apparently this was an activity monitor, which of course at the time was probably a pretty unique idea. This is it was published in 2008, so you figure they're doing it in 2006? So 11 years ago. And these activity trackers were fairly new. I know they were new to me then. I'm pretty used to them now. I bet that you are too. And apparently the feedback that you got from your activity is you either got a pretty and elaborate garden, if you had a lot of activity, or you had a pretty, or you had a not so good looking garden if you didn't have enough activity. So let's talk about data collection and analysis. Of course, we can do observation and interviews. So we can do that with notes and pictures and recordings, video, logging, which by logging here we mean interaction logging, keystrokes, clicks, screen touches, all that kind of stuff. And then we need to analyze these findings. So we're going to need to categorize them. And how can we categorize them? Well, let's go back to some other discussion that we had earlier in the course about social science research, okay? Well, we can discover the categories, or we can determine the categories using the things we learned about a grounded theory, or perhaps activity theory. So perhaps a look back at those kinds of things, which are a number of chapters ago, will be helpful at this point. Data presentation. How do we present this? Well, the aim is to show how the products are being appropriated and integrated into their surroundings. So what do we mean by appropriated? Well, I think the closest thing we have to that is appropriated used in a negative sense. Well, we've heard people who have adopted some of the practices of minority groups have been accused of cultural appropriation. So we take some kind of a culturally significant artifact and we incorporate it into our lives in a way that makes it ours. Okay, sort of implies some sort of ownership of it. Well, here, ideally, we're looking for people to take these products and really integrate them into their lives and exert some kind of ownership on them. So we're looking for appropriation in a positive sense, but it's really the same behavior. It's just a question of whether we want to pat the people on the back for it, or whether we want to complain that that's not appropriate behavior. I guess I shouldn't have used the word appropriate to talk about appropriated, but I did. Sorry. Are they using this junk, right? And typical presentations would be vignettes, excerpts, critical incidents, patterns, and narratives. So we have all these observations, right? So we may have some notes, we may have videos, we may have recorded, audio recorded interviews. We may have seen some particular critical incidents happen, and we're just gonna. This is the research. So these are the kind of things that we're looking for. We're looking for ways to present our findings that are founded in our observations. Okay, and here's some key points from the chapter. Okay, so usability testing really does have a testing kind of a focus. So it's going to go on in some kind of a lab. It's either going to go on in a controlled usability lab or perhaps a temporary lab using some of that traveling lab equipment. Usability testing focuses on performance measures. And the kind of things that we're able to measure is how long and how many errors are made when completing a set of predefined tasks. How do we do this? Well, we do this by indirect observation, user satisfaction questionnaires, and interviews. We did see an example of a portable usability lab, and we could see that they even contain some fairly interesting testing equipment, stuff like eye tracking devices. When we really started talking about experiments, we got back to the old scientific method. And we're saying here that experiments test a hypothesis by manipulating certain variables while keeping others constant. The experimenter controls the independent variables in order to measure the dependent variables. Field studies are evaluation studies that are carried out in natural settings to discover how people interact with technology in the real world. Field studies involve deployment of prototypes or technologies in natural settings may also be referred to as in the wild, and our best example of that was probably the application that they gave to the skiers. Sometimes the findings of a field study are unexpected, especially for in the wild studies in which we explore how novel technologies are used by participants in their own homes, places of work, or outside. And so these are things that really deal with less the specifics of how we have just interactions with some part of the device or the application, but kind of bigger picture issues of the use case. How would we use a device or a solution like this in our life? So that's it. Hopefully this will help you focus on the kind of studies that you want to do, because that's what we want to drive in your thinking. And good luck with that. I'm going to say bye until next time. Bye-bye.